I've chosen as our opening words this morning a responsive reading by Olympia Brown. Stand by This Faith is number 569, and you can find it in the back of our hymnal. Let's have this side of the sanctuary start with the bold words, and this side of the sanctuary will join in the italics. Stand by this faith, work for it, and sacrifice for it. Which has comforted us in sorrow, strengthened us for noble duty, and made the world beautiful. Do not fear yourselves, but rejoice that we are worthy to be entrusted with this great message. That you are strong enough to work for a great true principle without counting the cost. Go on finding better in your applications of these truths, and when you rejoice in their contemplation, always trusting in the one God, which ever lives and loves. Spirit of life, be with us in this time of prayer. Help us to feel the rhythm of our own breathing, to quiet the chatter in our heads, to feel at home in our bodies. Help us to feel grounded and centered, to embrace the stillness. Comfort us in our sadness, accompany us in our joy, hold us in our unknowing. Spirit of life, be with us when we leave this sanctuary. Help us to carry with us the strength of connectedness, the warmth of companionship, the energy of community. Enfold us in a sense of spirit, move with us in grace, soothe us in our wounded places, forgive us our missteps. Spirit of life, we ask this of you, knowing that we are your hands in this world, and that the answer to this prayer comes when we begin to do all of this for and with each other. Amen. Our reading this morning is by Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, entitled How the World is Made. In Cat's Cradle, Kurt Vonnegut offers a wry view of how the world is made. The basic unit of God's organization of things is the charos, a group of people who have been born in order to serve one of God's purposes and who serve it flawlessly, often without ever knowing they are doing this. A charos may be as large as several thousand people or as small as two lovers. No matter. The lives of those in a charos revolve around the holy purpose that has called them into being in much the same way that electrons revolve around the nucleus of an atom. Some orbit at a distance from the common purpose. Others are very close to it. But all are held in relationship to it because it has magnetized their souls. The people in any charos differ widely in age, color, and creed. They may speak different languages, be educated or uneducated, rich or poor, foolish or wise. Some may actually know each other and even work together, and others may never meet in their lifetimes. No matter. Their lives fit together perfectly in the service of the purpose. When I first read this, continues Remen, I imagined that the purpose of a charos would be visible to the naked eye. And indeed, this may sometimes be the case. There is surely a charos behind the abolition of slavery, women's rights, most life-saving medical devices and advances, and all ecological concerns. But just as often, a karas may have a purpose known only to God and understandable only from God's vast perspective, such as the saving of some single life who will become the great-grandmother of someone else, whose work will cause a sweeping change for all of humanity. I have begun to find this tongue-in-cheek description of the world more and more compelling over the years. It has explained a great deal of my own experience. And something else Vonnegut says rings true for me as well, despite the apparent differences between them. The variations in social status, experience, language, religion, age, gender, roles in life, and the like. Should members of a karas happen to meet, they will feel their kinship instantly, even though it does not make sense to them. Life can be a lonely thing. In the presence of another member of your family of service, that loneliness may ease a little. I have always loved how the mother Sophia on the TV show The Golden Girls started her stories. "Picture it," she would say. "Picture it, Sicily, 1934. Well, that is how I'd like to start my sermon today. Not bringing you back to girlhood remembrances of Sicily, but asking you to transport yourself back in time to the mid-1800s, to a farm in rural Illinois. Picture it, Hamilton, Illinois, 1850. A young girl stands on a tree stump in the front yard of her farm, not far from the bank of the Mississippi River. She is amusing her family by preaching to them in a loud and confident voice from her perch on the stump. The performance seems harmless enough even to her mother, who is sure that her daughter Mary will grow up to work for the church in a woman's supportive role. She will lend her hand in the kitchen and pray from the pews. But Mary has other ideas. Every day she runs to the orchard to meet her best friend Eleanor, who lives nearby. The two are inseparable. They are a comical pair. Mary is tall, thin, and elegant. Eleanor is sturdy, strong, and plain, but laughing all the time. Mary is good in front of a crowd, always with polished, articulate things to say. Eleanor is better with people, easily conversing with an individual or small circle. They both love to read. At Eleanor's house, there isn't much to read except for the radical Unitarian journals left out by her aunts and uncles, who like to debate religion. So when she's exhausted those, she goes over to Mary's house, which has a grand library. As a teenager, Mary sets up the Hawthorne Literary Society. She gets Eleanor and all the brothers and sisters involved, and they read book reviews, essays, poetry, and plays. They hold debates and even host some guest lecturers, including the local Unitarian minister, Oscar Clute. Mary takes a break from all that intellectual seriousness and organizing and goes to Eleanor's house for some fun. But their favorite place to be together is under the apple trees in Eleanor's back orchard. They spend hours there, and it is there when the girls are in their early 20s that they pledge to spend their lives together, serving the world as a team. Marriage isn't for them, they decide. They are modern women. They know how capable they are and don't want anyone telling them how to do what they already know how to do for themselves. They dream of graduating from college, but both are forced home after only a year at Iowa State University, Eleanor because of money and Mary because of an illness at home. They take it upon themselves to continue their own education. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Robert Browning, Theodore Parker. They are always reading, and figuring out how they can best serve the world. Fast forward a few years. Picture it, Humboldt, Iowa, 1883. It is the cusp of a new century and life is good but hard. It's still the frontier with no conveniences. Surviving the winter is a struggle. But every Sunday, the local farmers lay down their work and ride in their horse and buggies to church. The sermons are rousing and thought-provoking. The words of the hymns have been changed slightly to be more inclusive. There are lay voices involved in the service, as well as clergy. Throughout the week, families have been to church for lectures and dinners. The church itself is a little bit like a family, like a home. This is not church as remembered from the East, but a new model formed to meet the needs of the people. Eleanor is there, giving instruction on religious education to the same kids that she sees during the week as the town's school principal. And up at the front, preaching to a packed house, is Mary. Can you picture it? It's an amazing but true story of Mary Safford and Eleanor Gordon, two women who would become the unofficial leaders of a band of liberal women ministers on the frontier at the tail end of the 19th century. Although the term had not been dreamed up yet, Mary and Eleanor were undoubtedly part of the same kairos. That is, their souls had been magnetized to the same purpose in life, to spread liberal religion as two of the first ordained female ministers, and to mentor other women into the ministry as well. With plenty of cushy churches sitting prominently on town greens back in the East, young male seminarians and married ministers from New England were not easy to lure out west to the border of civilization. Mary and Eleanor took advantage of that void, starting up their own church in Hamilton, which overflowed each Sunday with 200 people, then moving to Humboldt to take over the leaderless Unitarian parish there. On June 29, 1880, Mary Safford was ordained in Humboldt's Unity Church, and 9 years later, Eleanor Gordon followed suit. Mary and Eleanor were not the very first women to receive full ministerial status in an American denomination. That honor falls on Olympia Brown, author of this morning's responsive reading. A Universalist, she was ordained in 1863, and there were a handful of others. But the story that has always entranced me and inspired me is the story of Mary and Eleanor, because after hammering the door open for themselves, they held it open for other women to follow behind them. At her ordination, Mary was told by the Iowa Unitarian Association secretary that in her mothering role as a minister, she must not neglect the rearing of new offspring, especially daughters, to carry the ministry forward. Having battled bureaucracy and isolation in her own ministry, Mary became a mentor for other aspiring female ministers. Young girls who were at home reading, and dreaming of how they could best serve the world. Mary's theology represented the growing edge of the evolving Unitarian denomination, stretching the comfort level and patience of her counterparts back east. Cynthia Grant Tucker, a historian of women in the Unitarian Universalist ministry, writes, "In these early 1880s, Safford's ethically based, humanistic approach to religion would have displeased the many Unitarians who still felt a strong attachment to the Christological underpinnings. True religion, she submitted, must first of all be free religion, free from dogma that discouraged personal growth. Then, too, it must be understood as part of human experience. It must be put to the test of reason in people's everyday living, and, like the modern world, was best understood as a process that worked through community. The services in Humboldt revolved around current affairs and stressed community service. And part of Mary and Eleanor's service to the world was to encourage other women to follow them into the ministry, hiring them as parish assistants and underwriting their educations. They offered advice and an understanding ear as the growing group of women faced similar challenges. Years before women achieved the right to vote, those 20 or so liberal women banded together against adversity to form the first professional network of female ministers. Joining Mary and Eleanor in their ministry were Florence Buck, Mary Colson, Caroline Bartlett Crane, Mary Jenny Howe, Ida Holton, Rowena Morse Mann, Helen Grace Putnam, among others. Mary Safford was the unofficial leader and Humboldt the unofficial headquarters of what came to be known as the Iowa Sisterhood. Picture it: Sioux Falls, Dakota, 1887. A team of female ministers has raised money to construct the Sioux Falls Unity Church to house the growing liberal religious population. Caroline Bartlett and Eliza Wilkes are the ministers. One Sunday, a little girl looks up at a neighboring pastor who has exchanged pulpits for the week and says with a shock for all to hear, "Look, Mama, there's a man up there in the pulpit." I'd really like to end the sermon here. I like to hold this picture in mind. A little girl so used to seeing female leadership that she is surprised to see a male minister. A little girl who, having experienced life in this congregation, will then go on to work for women's suffrage and in her lifetime achieve the right to vote. The story of the Iowa Sisterhood is an inspiring one, but it isn't the whole story. So it wouldn't be fair to let you believe that this momentum carried Unitarian and Universalist women ministers into the 20th century in a continuous stream. The reality is that as the century turned, the growth of women in the ministry stopped abruptly, and their numbers plummeted. There is not one clear-cut explanation for this. There were many contributing factors, including changes that were happening within the circles of women themselves, within the structures of the denomination, and in the larger context of American society in the 20th century. Surplus churches in small towns, migration to cities, the liberalizing of mainstream Protestant churches. But a major factor was unsupportive institutional leadership, including a very hostile Samuel Atkins Elliott, newly named president of the American Unitarian Association. During his presidency, Elliott strengthened the institutional nature of the Unitarian Church, but also its discrimination against women. Although inspired by their liberal religious faith, early female clergy were continuously frustrated by the American Unitarian Association, the Universalist Church of America, and their associated seminaries, who continuously denied entry for women. Tired from their struggle and resentful that all of their success as ministers was being ignored based on their sex, many women left the ministry, took their ministry outside the confines of the church, and abandoned the priority of mentoring the next wave of female ministers. This is not to say that any of these strong women gave up the struggle completely. Many turned their energy to street ministry or the women's suffrage movement, where they felt they were being more effective. But they were tired of doing their fighting within their own denominations. In 1962, Violet Kochendorfer was ordained into the Unitarian Universalist ministry. These are words from the sermon preached at her ordination. This is a historic occasion in our denomination. It is not often that we have the privilege of ordaining a woman to our parish ministry. Out of nearly 1,000 ministers, I think that you are number 3 or 4 in the women's group. I need not remind you that the way is twice as difficult for a woman. Her ministry has to be superior in every way to make it possible for her to have a career in this profession. She will have to continually hammer at the doors of prejudice to make sure her ministry is taken seriously. But it can be done, and I know you have accepted the challenge that confronts you. Hearing those words, it's hard to imagine that they are words from 1962 and not 1862, but there it is. 100 years after the Iowa Sisterhood, at a ministers' meeting with 20 male colleagues, Kochendorfer was once asked, "How would you like us to treat you, Vi? As a lady or as a minister?" Though in the 1960s, Violet and a few other pioneer women went it alone as the second wave of barrier breakers in the ministry, numbers really only started rising again when a new sisterhood was formed in the 1970s. I want you to know, though, that Provincetown should be extremely proud of its own history in embracing female leadership. That minister, Violet Kochendorfer, who fought for her rightful place at male-dominated minister meetings, served here as your minister from 1961 to 1963. I also follow 3 other settled female ministers who have held this pulpit: Reverend Kim Crawford Harvey, Reverend Jennifer Justice, and Reverend Allison Hyder. And in fact, this church owes its very formation to 2 little girls who were curious, intelligent, and open to a new religious message. Picture it, Provincetown, 1820. Just a few years before Mary and Eleanor strike up their childhood friendship, 2 young sisters, Sylvia and Elizabeth Freeman, are walking along the shore searching for driftwood. They spot in the seaweed a small leather-covered and waterlogged book. Wading out, they bring it to shore. Also avid readers, the girls bring home the book like a treasure and dry it out. It is the life of the Reverend John Murray, preacher of universal salvation. Known as the father of Universalism, John Murray formed the first Universalist church in America in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Sylvia and Elizabeth pored over his messages of God's love and universal salvation for all and shared it with their parents. Soon, cousins and neighbors had also read the book and were discussing its ideas. These meetings of kindred spirits were the first meetings of what would become our own Universalist Meeting House. I encourage you to go to our church website, where you can read the text of that inspirational book. You should also know that today, Unitarian Universalists have one of the highest percentages of women in the ministry. And looking around my seminary classes, I saw more women than men. In her book, The Prophetic Sisterhood, Tucker writes, "The story of the Iowa Sisterhood speaks of the deep and sustaining power that comes from affirming our place in an unbroken line of kindred seekers and prophets." To me, their story also speaks of the deep and sustaining power that comes from seeking out in our own lives the support of kindred seekers. The Iowa Sisterhood succeeded out there on the frontier because they banded together. They did not work alone. And how much easier is it to keep going when we have company for the journey? Rachel Naomi Remen, author of today's reading, writes, Self-reliance, self-determination, and self-sufficiency are so deeply admired among us that needing someone is often seen as a personal failing. 100 years after the end of the frontier, we still inhabit its culture. Self-sufficiency was critically important when you lived 100 hostile miles away from your nearest neighbor, but we live in this way still, 3,000 to a city block. Needing others has come to require an act of courage. The Iowa Sisterhood had the courage not only to break down barriers of culture and institution, but also the courage to need each other and to reach out to each other for support. When we are faced with our own challenges, it is so easy to feel overwhelmed and alone. But maybe instead, we could all imagine ourselves as part of some sort of invisible or visible karass. Imagine a world where we are strengthened by a sense of connection to an unseen tapestry of others working toward the same purpose as ourselves. Imagine each one of us feeling a part of a sisterhood or brotherhood, so that whatever we decide to devote our lives to, we are not alone. Imagine it. Actually, picture it. Amen, and blessed be.